I finished my doctoral thesis in social anthropology as part of the Ethics of Oil Research Group, which actually preceded the establishment of the Centre for Energy Ethics. And what drew me to that research group was its focus on economic, moral, and social life and how they intertwine in forming our energy landscapes. So prior to my PhD, I'd done a dissertation studying moral and economic value within a financial investment fund in London. And I was also involved with different environmental groups who were working on divestment and also were working on greening, as they called it, the financial system. So with that kind of background, I joined the Ethics of Oil group and its endeavor to explore what can be quite polarized or sensitive energy and climate issues. So today I'll tell you a bit about my own research project within the group. I'll start by talking about the location and the kind of background of my field site. Then I'll talk about what my fieldwork consisted of and my methodologies. And I'll give you a brief, hopefully I won't speak for too long, summary of my main research findings through these three keywords of truth, action, and transition. And then at the end, if I still have a bit of time, I'll tell you about the next research project I'll be part of at the University of Manchester, which is on a project that's looking at nuclear waste management. Yes, so my PhD project took me to the region of Lancashire in the northwest of England, where I examined the resistance against hydraulic fracturing for gas. The site people were resisting is called Preston New Road. It's located between Preston and Blackpool in the region of Lancashire, and it's just off the side of a very busy highway that connects these two cities. That site became a real focus point for different environmental groups and for the shale gas industry, because it symbolized the potential start of the new fossil fuel industry in the UK. So I mentioned the word shale industry. So that shale is the type of rock that the company operating this site were interested in. You can see on the left here on the slide, the kind of outline of this shale deposit, which stretches across northern England, the Midlands, parts of Wales, and it traps gas in its tight, impermeable rock. So just as a little technical aside, and sorry for those who already know about this, but to give you a little explanation of what hydraulic fracturing actually consists of. So extracting gas from this shale rock is referred to as unconventional gas extraction. So wells are drilled into the rock deposit, and these wells have to be stimulated through hydraulic fracturing. And hydraulic fracturing is a stimulation technique which consists of injecting a mixture of chemicals, sands, and liquids at high pressure. It fractures the rock and it allows the gas to flow back to the surface. So this kind of extraction is associated with the risk of pollution from the hydraulic fluid, which is injected to fracture the shale, and a subsequent risk of earth tremors or subsidence in the weakened rock. So the existence of these risks is uncontroversial, but the size and the importance of the risks are harder to establish. And kind of establishing the magnitude and the importance of these risks was central to the very polarized debate around the shale gas industry in the UK. So back to the context of my field site at Preston New Road, the government was really, and pro-shale supporters, not just the government, but the British government was very inspired by the shale revolution, which Sean actually studies in his work in the United States. And so from 2012 and 2013 onwards, they really actively encouraged research on this kind of gas extraction. And so the people I met, many of my interlocutors, they'd been involved in campaigning against fracking since then, since 2013. They'd done all sorts, they'd raised awareness through organizing public events. They'd spoken to their political representatives, written to members of parliament, they'd signed petitions, they'd been involved in public consultations to express their views about fracking. And then so you can see what the site looks like. This is when it was built. But in 2015, the local council, Lancashire County Council, refused the planning application for this site. So my interlocutors were overjoyed. They thought this was great. This was local democracy in action that was working. But then the following year, that decision was overturned by the government. And they were really disillusioned by this. They thought it was kind of a betrayal. That's what they said, an affront to local democracy. And I explore that a bit in my thesis. So the site did go ahead. It was built over 2017. And from that first day of construction in January 2017, there was a constant activist presence on the roadside, a physical presence, because people wanted to keep showing their opposition to this site that was now being built. So I arrived there in 2018, at the end of 2018, and I stayed until December 2019. And over that period, the 2 wells that were drilled on this site were indeed fracked. And then a moratorium came in November 2019, following the second round of fracks. And this was due to occurrences of earth tremor, which were much larger than were expected. So the Oil and Gas Authority, as it was called at that time, eventually instructed Quadrilla to decommission the site. But last year, they withdrew this order and gave the company until June this year to evaluate its options for the site. So that's the kind of context of where I did my fieldwork and why this site was important. And I followed people's involvement in the anti-fracking campaign for those 12 months. And for those of you not familiar with anthropological research, the methods tend to be very immersive. They tend to be very close to the communities whose worldviews you're interested in. So that looks obviously different from field site to field site. For me, it meant attending daily protests on the roadside. It meant helping with the monitoring activities that people did on this roadside, because they paid very close attention to what was going on. They noted everything they saw on the roadside in logbooks, and they shared this online with anyone who was interested. So I helped with that. I also lived on one of the protest camps that was built further down the road from the site. And I accompanied people to events and activist gatherings across the country. So my life was really merged with the people who lived on this roadside. So if anyone's interested in this kind of anthropological research, I'd love to take questions on this in the Q&A. And as a little aside on anthropology itself, I just wanted to point out that I really love this method of investigating. I kind of see it as a form of journalism, but a very slow, reflective, and empathetic journalism, the academic form of journalism. And I really like it because it doesn't, unlike newspaper commentary, it doesn't tend to short-term news cycles. It's really interested in people's longer stories, like their whole life stories. And those are the kind of stories that sometimes overlooked because they have become so normalized. We think we know what they mean, or they seem too anecdotal to be insightful at all. So at Preston New Road, PNR as I call it, and as people called it, I really tried to understand what stories were unfolding on this roadside, on this quite busy roadside. So here you can see lots of different kind of actions that my interlocutors were taking part in. You can see some people locking on to different devices. You can see the monitoring station in the top middle picture, from which people paid close attention to the site. People walked very slowly in front of vehicles to delay delivery. So there's all sorts going on over the 3 years that people stayed on this roadside. And you have to imagine it's, people stood there through, freezing temperatures, through heat waves. There was also snow, and yet they still showed up and they still came there every day. So for me, I was really trying to understand what it meant for people when they decided to step out in front of these vehicles. Sometimes it would be quite shocking to see, like they'd be lying down in front of them with their legs under it even. And that kind of gesture became more and more legible to me as I slowly understood the depth of people's feelings and the depth of what they felt was a real struggle against fracking. And so they called this a frontline. So that's a framing concept in my work, the front line. And I tried to understand how their engagement with this energy infrastructure took them in all sorts of direction. And at the end of the day, fracking is what tied all these experiences together for them. So it's as if I kind of picture it in my head as if the roadside became a space where all these different doorways popped up. And as people tried to engage with fracking, they crossed these doorways and felt like they couldn't come back. They couldn't walk back through the doorways. And this is literally what people would tell me. They'd say activism is like walking through a door and seeing something completely differently now. So in my thesis, I kind of explore these different doorways, let's say. So I look at how people contested the technical depictions of fracking. I look at how they had these democratic concerns, how this was tied into class issues in the UK as well. I looked at how they really were existentially worried about climate change, which they talked about as ecological and societal collapse. So they use the word collapse a lot. They also reckoned with the legal system, and they had very tense confrontations with the police force. That was a big part of their struggle on this front line. And they also, you know, a lot of them were involved in this form of activism full time. So they didn't necessarily have an income source or another kind of, you know, employment. This was their life full time. So I also look at how they made a living on this front line. And that topic is actually what I look at in an article that just came out beginning of this year in Economic Anthropology, if you'd like to have a look at it. It's called Jobbos and the Wageless Life, and it looks at conceptualisations of work and responsibility on the front line. So that's why I talk about this front line as one big front line. That's actually a quote that someone told me during my fieldwork. They felt this front line was one big front line. And they also felt that they were confronting not just the fracking sites, but the whole system that enabled the fracking site to emerge. So the system that says fracking is okay, as that person told me. So in my thesis, I talk about this as a line of techno-scientific contestation, but it's also a frontier of ethical action, where people feel like they're experiencing the world differently, and they see their responsibilities in that world very differently. So I want to just talk about that a bit more through the concept of truth. So it struck me during my first few months of fieldwork that people rarely seem to discuss the technical and mechanical details of fracking. They'd only talk about them if I explicitly asked for them. So one explanation is, of course, that they'd already told this to many people before me. They'd been campaigning for 2 years by the time I got there. But I took this something different. Like, really, when people were saying words like fracking or frack off, as you can see in this picture, that's what they thought fracking was, something that was bad and wrong. It was an insult. So it's a very morally loaded term. And on multiple occasions, they also described fracking as raping the earth or poisoning the land. Words like injecting toxic sludge, and they talk about the equipment that entered the site as weapons of destruction, destructive weapons. So these were the kind of words that formed a central part of people's justification for taking action against fracking. But it also, it became apparent that they did really, really care, and they did really pay attention to the operational technicalities of this site. So even though they didn't talk about it when I arrived, it wasn't part of our conversation, a lot of what they were doing was trying to figure out the technicalities of fracking, was tracking it very closely on the roadside. They learned about legal rules and regulations. They noticed and reported breaches of the different environmental permits that were granted to Quadrilla. And together, all of this, they called this bearing witness to what fracking truly was. That's what they said. And what fracking truly was sometimes diverged from the accounts of fracking, the technical accounts of fracking that were given by the industry or by governmental officials. So there was a clash there on the kind of right way to talk about fracking, to describe fracking. And for my interlocutors, this went hand in hand with climate truth. Again, they talked about truth, about climate change as climate truth. That's the word they used. And they discussed that truth as something that needed to be recognized and acted on. They also learned about how the legal system operates. So the kind of actions they took on the roadside would sometimes land them in courtrooms. And there they'd clash with the judges. who had this different notion of legal truth and what's legally okay to do. So throughout my whole thesis, I kind of tried to show that within this polarized national debate on the benefits and harms of the shale gas industry, there was a real conflict between different truths and different realities. And for my interlocutors, these different depictions of fracking they indexed one another. The technical and legal details went with the visceral emotions and the moral comments, which also went with the realities of climate change. And all these depictions were entangled. And that's how, for my interlocutors, we should be talking about fracking. They thought the truth about fracking should engage these multiple dimensions. So that's why in my work, I talk about exploring truth, action, and transition from this ethical perspective. What is the truth about fracking for my interlocutors? What should be the truth? And what do they think ought to be done about it? And so whether they were in these court proceedings, whether they were confronting the police officers on the protest site, they were reconfiguring their notions of personal and collective responsibilities towards this truth. And they were trying to find the right way to show that fracking was wrong. And I take this quote from Mario Blazo, which I forgot to put on the slide, but he talks about people enacting worlds in which or with which they want to live. And that's what my interlocutors were doing. They weren't just resisting fracking, they were taking action for a world that they wanted to live in or didn't want to live in. So action is also a key word here. It was very central to this notion of truth and to what people were doing on this protest frontline. They took inspiration from histories of protests in the UK that weren't necessarily directly related to energy or climate concerns, but where people had also used their bodies physically to create change and to take a stance against what they think is morally wrong and what they think should be true. So in this sense, my thesis also kind of complements all this big strand of research that looks at resistance and social movements and looks at how those spaces create space for change at different scales, from the personal and intimate to more kind of systemic levels. So for my interlocutors, this looked like the kind of actions they took looked like direct action and physical protest. So just a little note on the kind of common meaning of direct action. Direct action, as it's talked about by activists, is often in contrast to strikes or rallies or public marches and that kind of thing. The latter are a form of pressure on an official body to push them to change something or to implement a new policy or something, whereas direct action enables participants to directly stop something from taking place without going through any intermediaries. So on the roadside, at the PNR roadside, that was most recognizable when bodies were literally on the line, when people did stop and did stand in front of these vehicles or stood on the roadside to stop the vehicles from entering the site. They'd plan these direct actions very carefully. Sometimes it could be spontaneous, but sometimes they'd plan it very carefully. They'd have these devices called lock-ons, and they'd tie themselves to each other through these devices and really blockade the entrance to the site. That made it very difficult for security guards or police officers to remove them. It took a long time to cut them out, as it's called, and move them. So direct action seems like it refers to that kind of intervention, but through the 12, 13 months I was there, other practices like monitoring or even contributing to camp chores were also really explicitly acknowledged as very critical elements of the fight against fracking. So, people didn't just do these very visible lock-ons. They'd also contribute their time, financial resources, they'd donate equipment to the camp, they'd take part in legal research, legal processes, they'd also donate food or prepare food for people who were on the roadside, they'd engage with the media. So there was all sorts of activities that were happening here and that tied in to this broader notion of direct action. So it's a broader way of looking at, of celebrating direct action as taking responsibility for what to do to create a frack-free world, as they called it. So many of them felt that what they were doing on this frontline was very valuable form of work. That's what I look at in my article, a work that was resisting fracking and creating a new reality, not just the lock-ons, let's say. And so looking at protest activities in that way actually kind of broadens what's typically understood, not only as work, but what's typically understood as activism and who an activist is. So sometimes people would say, oh, I'm on the margin of the movement, I don't really do much. And then someone else would say, no, they're actually quite central to the movement. Because of these differences in how visible different actions were. But to me, this reflected, this kind of testified that being an activist was way less of wasn't really an identity, it was more a set of practices and actions that people took together on this front line. So that's why I try and use the words in the thesis, I try and use words like people campaigning or people protesting or people engaged in activism rather than activists, because actually that category wasn't very clear cut. And so the last keyword that I talk about that kind of frames the thesis is this transition word. So as people came together to take action against fracking, to establish the truth about fracking, they really felt that they were changing and that something was changing in them and in how they experienced the world around them. So you can see a quote there from one of my interlocutors that she felt she and other people could not go back. I can never go back to how life was before once they'd crossed this series of doorways on the front line. And so that meant that it wasn't always clear what a victory might look like for people beyond the sites shutting down. So when the moratorium came in, that was celebrated, it felt like a real victory. And now currently the site is dormant, it's kind of mothballed. So that is a form of victory. But because this struggle against fracking entailed all these different kind of issues that collided on the front line, it kind of broadens what we think about when we think about energy infrastructures and resistance against energy infrastructures. So people had, you can see here through the kind of different placards, people had different, there was a merging of all these different reasons that brought people to the front line. The end of fossil fuel expansion, strengthening local democracy and decision making, reclaiming their own kind of individual agency, forming a community and reclaiming collective agency, and of course finding alternative ways of living in a world where climate change is more and more visible. So that's kind of how I see an energy ethics approach, is that matters of energy and energy transitions and the technical truths that they call upon are not limited to the kind of energy source that's being extracted or consumed. They extend to the kind of meaningful personal and collective realities that are being fueled through these energy sources. And that's really how I read my interlocutors' activities on this roadside. So that's the broad kind of overview of what my doctoral research project was about. And just to finish, I'm briefly mention the next research project that I'll be part of. So it's called Mimesis in Action. I never actually know how to pronounce that word, mimesis, I think. And this is a project at the University of Manchester at the Department of Social Anthropology, which is led by Dr. Petra Tjitske-Karlshoven. And so the title there, it's Nuclear Decommissioning as Conceptual Playground for Societal and Ecological Future Making. The aim of this project is to explore how people model the future and plan through it through engineering practices and through the kind of livelihoods that people imagine in relation to different nuclear sites. So there's 4 different settings in this project. They're all, each setting is either a site where there's a nuclear waste management site or a nuclear site or nuclear infrastructure that's being decommissioned. And my own fieldwork will be focused on nuclear waste management in France, in La Hague, which is in Normandy. So I'm just mentioning this here because I'd be really curious to hear in the audience if anyone sees has advice or sees any points of connections between my work and where this new project could go, I'd love to hear if you have any questions about the new project, because it could help me think about setting it up as I start it now. So obviously there's very different themes coming up with this new project. It's nuclear, which is a very different kind of energy infrastructure. It's not a fossil fuel, it's not a renewable. For a lot of the people I worked with in Lancashire, nuclear was actually quite contentious. People didn't really talk about it. I know that a lot of people were for it, but didn't dare say that, because they thought it would create a lot of conflict. And I also know a lot of people were against it. So I find it quite an interesting new energy source to look at now. And in this project, I'm hoping to work with engineers and people who work on this nuclear waste management site. So, kind of crudely speaking, insiders, not outsiders. But like I said before, it's not really about the label. It's not about the category. It's more looking at people's practices. So I'd be interesting to see any kind of points of connection of difference there with environmental activists. And there might not be as strong a polarization as existed in my fieldwork. And obviously a very different regional different particularities. So France is very different context to the UK culturally and politically. The nuclear industry there's very centralized, it's very well established, which is different to the shale industry, which hadn't really started in the UK when I was working on it. So that's kind of the new directions I'm excited to go into. But obviously there's a lot of connections with what I've been working on. And one of them is looking at material infrastructures as ethically and temporally complex entities, which are sustained by different practices, different affects, different values. So that's kind of the continuation between these two projects. And I'll be looking at how engaging with these infrastructures is actually a moment where people think about how they want to live truthfully. In my previous project, truth might not come into this new project, but how people want to create good livelihoods for themselves now and in the future. And so the point of connection would be this focus on time and temporality. At PNR, I looked at how people were inspired by histories of protest. I talked about this in a departmental seminar last week, and how they were also, how their actions were informed by their existential anxieties about the climate crisis. So now I'm kind of interested to see the temporal dynamics in relation to nuclear sites, which have a very particular kind of temporality associated with nuclear objects. So I'll be looking at how these temporal orientations work in relation to nuclear, and the kind of practices and values that are part of those temporal orientations. And again, how that feeds into what people think is a good way of living now and in the future. So there you go. I hope I didn't speak for too long. I didn't take the time. There you go, half an hour. So thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions about either my doctoral work or this new project, I'd be more than happy to talk about them. So that's it.